Thank you, David, and thanks for the invitation. This work is a result of work that Dr. Douglas Headley did back for CAPI in 2012, looking at the food processing trade balance, and the subsequent discussions that David and I had prior to and after Doug's discussion report, where Doug left several questions for everybody to look at about how this plays into the investment issues for food processors, and my experience in an investment side for governments and economic development. So which one? This one? Yeah. So for those who saw the paper, Dr. Headley looked at a number of issues and looked at the trade balance over time and raised the issue that over a fairly short period of time, there's deteriorating trade balance, particularly in a key sector of the broad economy, but particularly in the agri-food sector. And as you can see, a substantial drop. As I mentioned, David and his team worked with us at the George Morris Center, where I was at the time, and following along with several other colleagues, as you'll hear from my panel colleagues, of work looking at this in much more substance, cutting through the trade balance and seeing what really went down, what stayed even, what went up. And then we looked at, I was asked to, and I offered to, let's look beyond the usual suspects. What is really driving this? What are the real drivers of competitiveness besides the perception that's exchange rates or just wage rates? And how do less talking about the wide open sector, who usually do not make the decisions, but individual firms, hence the title, looking at macro issues and micro decisions. If you take a look at it in the report that David and his team will release at some point along with the other packages, you can look at a wide range, and in our discussions, CAPI board and David raised a number of other drivers of competitiveness, and taking a look at what does this impact? How do we compare? Do we have enough information? So I'm going to give you two quick slides. Here is another manufacturing sector, one that the food processing sector particularly compared itself to when the motor vehicle industry kind of dropped off in 2008, 2009. It's picked up again. But as you can see, even though they had a very tough part of the year, part of this decade, they've come back up, even though the exchange rates are relatively high. The other one we want to look at, we always focus usually on our issues, our costs, our pricing in Canada. Well, what about the competitors? And again, exact example we use is you look at the wine industry in terms of wine sales in this country, you have two things that have happened. We're a very affluent economy, developed economy, taste and preferences. People like wines, they get exotic wines, they want more different wines, widen their tastes. Wine consumption has gone up over a period of time. You have, on the other side, the best domestic capacity to produce wines is limited by our climate and available land in certain parts of this country. But you also see, and it may be hard to follow, what was there in 1988, I believe is the year in 1990, just after the free trade agreement was completed, just after the two key provinces, Ontario and BC, had to do their wine adjustment. Focus was on the traditional wine-producing regions, United States and Europe. In the last decade and a half, 2 decades, those participants in our trade balance have declined in importance as the New World wines became much more important, much more fashionable, and much better quality in perception. So how do our competitors react over time also puts in what our domestic responses can be and how competitive we are. I can assure you in discussions that I was involved in 1986 to 88 in the Ontario wine industry, not once did anybody ever raise Chile, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, or a number of other nations. It was always either US, France, or Italy type issues. The key findings, this is just a couple of ideas of the slides. The complexity of this is something that we underestimate. And the complexity of decision-making for individual firms who then make up the industry total is something we haven't watched. There's lots of nuances. We have micro issues, where you are located, what's your labor pool, what's your historic cost advantage or not disadvantage, and where you're located in terms, and what's your product line, what you did in investment. If you're in a supply management sector, not supply management sector, we need to do more. And one issue that came up is in many cases we don't have the data because we never asked the questions. If we asked the questions, we didn't do the extensive analysis. Nobody really wanted to, nobody asked to. So really look at what does this mean over time, across regions, across jurisdictions, and a direct comparability. If you look at retail listing practices, in the previous panel, the question of the retail concentration. One thing the retail concentration does in most developed nations is the retailers are allowed to have listing practices, sometimes with legal control, sometimes not. Very reluctant by the processors to complain about it because it's their buyers. Very limited data, if anything, and terribly limited data over time across regions. How does one look at this issue if it is truly a competitive issue? The Agri-Food policy analysis, at least in one of the conclusions I raised through the report, is we could do a lot better here. And in many cases, we're making decisions on what we want for this sector with not very good data about what the decision processes are, what's driving them, and are we verifying them. David and his team, and you'll hear from the panel, they're doing more work in this area and it will become more fulsome over time, but they're finally getting at some of these issues in a far more disciplined way than the past. And there's roles. What is the leadership role of the companies? Are some of the leaders prepared to make the investments, prepared to take the risk, to innovate, to move into new markets, or they're feeling very complacent? How do we measure that? What do we look at what's the competitors doing? What are the demand shifts? And what are the legacy issues? In this last several months, we've had two key companies that have caught public attention, Heinz and Kellogg. There's a sense of, well, we lost the ball, they made decisions, this is a terrible issue. We have not put into context two companies built decades ago under different circumstances. We're here now. How did they make decisions in the last 2 decades, last decade? What does that mean for what they can do in the future? And what are the other options for those companies and their parent firms to do something different with the cash they have in other jurisdictions of the world, which may now be far more attractive than investing in Canada or in Ontario or in British Columbia, wherever. So these are the issues that we've raised. We've answered some of them, not all of them, and we, more importantly, raised for David and his team. Much more work has to be done here. Now I'm going to turn it over to my panel members.